Argentina's players thought the hardest part was over. They had survived the pressure. They had lived through the most emotional nights of the tournament, and they had walked off the pitch believing that whatever came next would be the usual fallout that follows a fierce World Cup battle. A few angry headlines, a few television debates, a few days of outrage online, and then football would move on. That is how these things usually work. The noise burns hot, the cycle turns, and the next story arrives before the consequences really land. But this time, something about the reaction felt different. This was not just post-match anger. This was not just one fan base hurting after a defeat. What began building around several Argentine players was something colder, broader, and potentially far more damaging than they may have imagined in the moment. Because the issue is no longer just what happened on the field. It is not even only about one banner, one comment, or one act of disrespect. It is about the collision between what those players did and where many of them earned their living. It is about the fact that some of the most controversial figures in this story are not distant outsiders to English football. They are part of it. They wear Premier League shirts. They collect Premier League wages. They play in stadiums filled by English supporters every single week. Their careers at the highest level are tied directly to the league, the clubs, and the culture they are now being accused of insulting. And that is where this stops feeling like ordinary tournament drama and starts feeling like something much more uncomfortable. At the center of that discomfort is a question that British fans have been asking ever since the controversy erupted. How do players who are celebrated, supported, and paid so heavily inside English football end up involved in a moment that so many people in England saw as deeply provocative? For critics, that contradiction has become the whole story. This is not just about rivalry. It is not just about emotion after a huge match. It is about the sense that certain lines were crossed by people who should have understood exactly where those lines were. And once that feeling took hold, the reaction spread fast. Not only through football circles, but through politics, media, and wider public opinion. Much of that backlash traces back to the Falklands banner, the image that turned a heated football moment into something far more politically charged. To understand why that image hit so hard in Britain, you have to understand that the Falklands War is not treated there like some forgotten argument in a history book. For many British people, it remains part of living memory. It is tied to real loss, real grief, and a national wound that never fully disappeared. Families remember the names. Older generations remember the news bulletins. The conflict may be decades old, but its emotional charge did not vanish with time. It stayed in the background, waiting. So when football brought England and Argentina together again under the pressure of a World Cup, that history was already in the air, whether anyone said it out loud or not. That is why the banner caused such an explosive response. For many viewers in England, it was not read as a football celebration. It was not seen as harmless passion or patriotic expression in the heat of victory. It was interpreted as a deliberate political message, pointed directly at a painful piece of history. And in the eyes of critics, the timing made it even worse. This happened after an emotionally brutal defeat, with English fans still in the ground and English players still processing the moment on the pitch. In other words, the gesture did not land in some neutral space. It landed at the exact point where sporting heartbreak and national sensitivity were colliding in full public view. That is why the outrage escalated so quickly. People were not reacting only to what was shown. They were reacting to what they felt it meant. And the banner, according to many critics, was only the beginning. What intensified the backlash was the idea that the incident formed part of a larger pattern of behavior. Christian Romero became one of the biggest targets of anger, not simply because of his association with the banner, but because of the way his conduct was interpreted around the match itself. Commentators and fans focused on confrontational moments, on the body language, on the decisions about who he chose to celebrate in front of, and how he carried himself when others were at their lowest. In football, those moments matter. They travel. They become clips. They become symbols. What might feel like a burst of adrenaline on the pitch can look very different once slowed down, replayed, and judged by millions of people the next morning. That is one of the harshest truths in modern football. Players do not just live through moments anymore. They leave them behind in high definition. Every gesture, every stare, every scream, every chest thump, every post-match image gets pulled apart by fans who already believe they know what kind of character they are looking at. So when critics look at Romero, They are not only seeing one incident, they are connecting it to a broader reputation. They are telling themselves a story about arrogance, about disrespect, about someone who seems drawn to the emotional pain of opponents instead of simply the joy of victory. Fair or not, once that reputation settles into the public mind, every new controversy becomes proof of the old one. Lisandro Martinez was drawn into the storm for similar reasons. Not because he said the most, because silence can sometimes be as provocative as speech when the public believes an apology or explanation should have come. For many fans, the issue was not merely participation in a controversial moment. It was the absence of remorse after it. Social media posts that might normally pass without notice suddenly began to look calculated, incomplete, even cold. In the middle of a public backlash, saying less does not always protect you. Sometimes it makes people imagine the worst. Sometimes it convinces critics that a player does not understand the scale of the anger against him, or worse, understands it and simply does not care. Then there is Enzo Fernandez, whose situation feels even more complicated because the backlash surrounding him was not limited to one football image. Critics tied his name not only to on-pitch controversy, but to remarks and incidents that many interpreted as insulting, dismissive, or tone-deaf, especially given his position inside English football. That is what gave the outrage extra force. People were not asking how a foreign player upset rival fans in the heat of a World Cup. They were asking how a man so enriched by English football appeared, in their view, so careless about the people and environment that helped elevate him. Once that idea began to spread, it became difficult to contain. Because football supporters can forgive many things, what they do not forgive easily is contempt, and that word, contempt, is really what fuels the entire reaction. Fans can accept defeat more easily than humiliation. They can accept rivalry more easily than mockery. They can accept an opponent celebrating, but they struggle to accept the feeling that they were being laughed at, demeaned, shamed, or politically provoked by players who then expect to return to England and resume their club lives as if nothing happened. That is where the story took on a new edge. The backlash stopped sounding like outrage over a tournament moment and started sounding like a warning about what comes next. Not maybe, not hypothetically, but when the season starts and these players walk back into the same stadiums, the same cities, and the same fan cultures they have now antagonized. For a while, the dominant speculation focused on visas, bans, investigations, and possible official punishment. Political voices added to the noise. Commentators asked whether there should be consequences beyond football. Some public figures demanded zero tolerance. Others wanted symbolic action. And in modern controversy culture, these calls spread fast because they offer people a neat answer. Revoke this, ban that, suspend them, deport them. It feels decisive. It feels satisfying. It feels like justice delivered in a clean line. But the deeper and more realistic consequence may be something far messier than any official sanction, because official punishment happens at all can still create distance. A ban removes a player from the scene. A visa issue turns the story into legal procedure. An investigation becomes paperwork, statements, and waiting. It takes the anger out of the stadium and puts it into institutions. But what many English fans seem to want is the opposite. They do not want the story to disappear into legal gray zones. They want it to stay alive in the most public place possible. They want the consequence to happen in front of people, under lights, inside grounds, packed with supporters who have had months to remember exactly how insulted they felt. That is why the most striking part of the backlash is not the demand to keep these players out of England. It is the demand to let them back in. Because from the perspective of many angry supporters, exclusion is too easy. Exclusion ends the emotional transaction. It gives players a route away from the environment they angered. It lets them escape into another league, another crowd, another story. But a hostile return is different. A hostile return means hearing the reaction in every away ground. It means the banner follows you, the comments follow you, the clips follow you, the reputation follows you. And in a sport built as much on atmosphere as talent, that kind of reception can become a punishment no tribunal can fully replicate. Think about what that means in practical terms. A player can ignore headlines. He can avoid interviews. He can shut off his phone, hire advisors, let lawyers speak, let clubs release careful statements. But he cannot fully silence a stadium. He cannot mute tens of thousands of voices when the team bus arrives. He cannot prevent every chant, every sign, every camera close-up. Every reminder from the terraces that fans have not forgotten. And English football, when it decides to turn a player into a villain, has a very particular way of doing it. It does not always need formal action. It can create a climate all by itself. That climate can follow a player from August to May and make every away game feel like a hearing with no judge and no end. For footballers who depend on rhythm, confidence, and emotional stability, that matters more than outsiders sometimes realize. People talk about hostile atmospheres as if they are just noise, but they are not just noise. They affect every touch, every misplaced pass, every moment a camera catches hesitation in the face. They shape how rivals target you, how pundits discuss you, how social media frames you, and how even your own supporters start to evaluate you once the burden of controversy becomes too heavy. A player can survive one ugly night. Surviving an entire season of sustained hostility is a completely different challenge. That is why some fans have started describing this possible return as the worst consequence of all. Not because it is legally the harshest, but because it is the most personal. A visa dispute is handled by institutions. A stadium backlash is delivered by people. Tells players, in real time and at full volume, exactly what the country thinks of them. And for athletes whose careers are built on public adoration, public hostility can cut especially deep. Not only because it damages comfort, but because it damages belonging. It sends the message that you may wear the shirt, collect the wages, and play in the league, but you are no longer emotionally protected by any of it. There is another layer here as well, and it is one clubs will be watching closely. Football clubs invest in players not only for ability, but for the stability of the product around them. A controversial player can still be valuable, but only if the controversy remains manageable. Backlash becomes cultural rather than temporary. Things get riskier. Sponsors notice, broadcasters notice, match day atmospheres shift. Every away trip becomes a security and narrative issue. Every press conference invites the same questions. The club's messaging gets dragged into the same story over and over. At that point, the problem is no longer limited to what happened at the World Cup. It becomes part of the domestic season before a ball has even been kicked. And that is where this whole situation starts to feel so much bigger than a few emotional scenes after an international match. It is becoming a test of whether players who represent one identity on the global stage can simply slide back into another identity at club level without paying a price. Supporters are asking whether football can really separate the two that cleanly. Can a player provoke English fans in one shirt and then expect those same fans or a connected football culture to forget it when he pulls on another? Technically, perhaps. Emotionally, that seems far less likely. Football does not compartmentalize the way official statements do. It remembers in chants. It remembers in nicknames. It remembers in atmospheres. The references to MLS and the United States that have appeared in some corners of the debate are revealing in their own way. They are not always literal predictions. Often they are more like sarcastic fantasies about where a player might feel more comfortable if England becomes too hostile. A place with less emotional connection to the Falklands issue, less direct sense of insult, less historical weight tied to the banner, less appetite to punish through atmosphere. Whether that actually happens is another matter entirely. But the fact that fans are even talking that way shows how far the reaction has moved. It is no longer about anger in the present tense. It is about imagining futures, exile, relocation, escape routes, and whether certain players have made English football emotionally unlivable for themselves. Still, all of this raises an uncomfortable question. Is the backlash proportionate, or has football once again become a stage where outrage grows faster than reflection? That question deserves to be asked, because public fury often simplifies what players themselves experience in the heat of high-pressure competition. World Cup matches distort judgment, emotions surge, national identity overwhelms restraint. People do foolish things in moments that feel bigger than life. That does not excuse everything, but it does explain why some observers may feel the reaction has become larger than the offense. And yet, even if that is true, it does not erase the central reality. In football, perception becomes consequence. Once enough people decide they have seen disrespect, the damage is already real whether the players intended it that way or not. And right now, that damage looks severe. Not necessarily in the form of one dramatic punishment handed down from above, but in the far more lingering form of resentment from below. The kind that does not disappear with one apology or one statement drafted by a public relations team. The kind that waits until the fixture list begins. The kind that listens for the first touch The first chant, the first trip to an away ground, the kind that makes every return feel less like a homecoming and more like an exam in front of a country that has already decided what it wants to say. In the end, that may be the real twist in this story. The players most at the center of the outrage may have expected investigations, maybe even sanctions. What they may not have expected was that so many English fans would reject the easy solution of making them disappear, because disappearance can feel merciful. What many supporters appear to want instead is memory, long memory, loud memory, stadium memory, the kind that cannot be avoided because it is built into the schedule. If that happens, then this controversy will not end with the World Cup. It will merely change location, from the international stage to the Premier League, from banners and post-match clips to chants and match days, from one political firestorm to a season-long emotional reckoning. So the question now is no longer just what these Argentine players did. The bigger question is, what happens when they come back? Will clubs shield them? Will statements calm the mood? Will time soften the anger? Or will the English game turn every away ground into a reminder that some actions do not stay in the past once the tournament ends? That is the uncertainty hanging over this story now. Not whether people are upset. That part is obvious. The uncertainty is whether the backlash fades with the news cycle or hardens into something much more lasting. And for players whose careers depend on English football, that possibility may be more threatening than any official punishment they feared at the start.